Hi, my name is Nicola Jennings. I'm Director of Kolnagi Foundation. Welcome to Kolnagi Foundation Lates, talks with interesting people about new art exhibitions, publications and events in the UK and around the world. I'm delighted to welcome Luke Syson. Luke is the director of the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. He's been there for about a year and a half. He came from the Metropolitan Museum in New York, where he was the Iris and B. Gerald Cantor Chairman of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts, and had oversight of the largest collection in America of European applied arts and sculpture, and was involved in the refurbishment of the British galleries. He created and supervised research and publication program of the European Sculpture and Decorative Arts, and a lot of other things as well. And before that, Luke was in London in the National Gallery. He was the curator of Italian painting before 1500 and head of research, responsible for many exhibitions, and was also involved in other initiatives such as the Enlightenment Gallery at the British Museum and the Medieval and Renaissance galleries at the V&A. So Luke has a stellar career, and we're very happy to have him back in the UK. What have been the challenges of coming back and being director of the Fitzwilliam Museum?
So I think the most exciting thing really is moving to a university museum for the first time in my professional life. So still very much a public body and a local attraction in Cambridge, but not the great vast private museum, for example, that the Met was, or with the direct links to government that the National Gallery and the British Museum have. So thinking through what a university museum does within the larger museum sector and for the art community in general has been the really interesting task over the last year and a half.
You have such a wide-ranging collection, like the British Museum, but with more paintings.
Yeah, so the Fitzwilliam Museum is an encyclopedic collection, which is fantastic, and my great joy is going back, for example, to coins and medals, where I began at the British Museum, to a collection of decorative arts as I worked on at the Met, and paintings as I thought about it so hard at the National Gallery. It's true to say, though, that it's a collection that defines itself by what was thought to be culturally important at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. And so, unfortunately, we don't have Pacific or African material. On the other hand, what's glorious is that we have the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology just down the road and as part of the University of Cambridge Museums consortium. So there's scope, I think, an increasing scope for interaction there as well.
What have you changed? Have you changed anything yet?
So the big project, I suppose, that we began with was the refurbishment of our biggest and grandest gallery. It's one of the most extraordinary galleries in any museum, actually, towering with extraordinary plasterwork. And that I worked with Jane Monroe on last year, and we opened last autumn. That was a sort of major project, both structural and aesthetic, and now houses some of our grandest British portraits and other paintings from the 16th, 17th and 18th century.
You have a fantastic collection of British paintings, and you also have a fantastic collection of British drawings. For example, this Isaac Oliver, which is just beautiful. I'd never seen anything like it. Have you got a programme of exhibitions that you're going to be presenting some of these drawings? Because obviously you can't keep them out all the time, can you?
So no, drawings circulate, of course, although we do have a very old-fashioned system of some cases with covers that you can lift and find the drawings underneath. So some of our Dutch and Flemish drawings appear there, and then we have regular exhibitions in the Charrington Print Room and other spaces that are dedicated to works on paper. I suppose, the big task is really to how to use that sort of collection most effectively. It is an incredible collection here, and of course goes right back to our founding collection of Viscount Fitzwilliam himself, who was a fanatical print collector, and many of his prints are still in their albums, which is also remarkable. So it's a real resource that needs to be investigated, and frankly, there's a lot of cataloguing and so on that still needs to be done as well. But so we had a wonderful show about Rembrandt's nudes just before we closed, and the quality of the impressions and the number of different states that we have of each work is really remarkable. So you can follow a narrative, not just of what he was depicting, but how he was making these things in our collection. And that's very exciting. I think what's also fantastic is that we can use these these drawings in a more narrative sense, to be investigated not just by art historians but by historians and others. For example, in the show that's just closed on Feast and Fast, documenting attitudes to food in the early modern period. So everything from depictions of the seasons, attitudes to fatness and thinness, satirical prints, and so on and so forth. And that's all here on site. You know, there are 500,000 objects at the Fitz, and that just gives us an incredible array. It's almost a sort of playground to explore any number of themes and ideas.
What was the reaction to the Feast and Fast exhibition?
So it was really positive, because of course what we were doing was examining an issue that remains completely current. So the curators, Victoria Avery and Melissa Calarezu from the history faculty here in Cambridge, thought about all sorts of topics that you might think were brand new. So veganism or responsible use of local produce as opposed to exotic imports, what one might describe as food porn, you know, the whole kind of dressing up of food to make it as appealing as possible. Diets, whether for health or for girth, all things that we might think of as being kind of the obsessions of Instagram and the magazines, but there were the equivalents in the past. You know, 10 quick ways to lose weight is not something that we invented. So I think what we were able to do was not just bring out material that hadn't necessarily been seen, but ask new questions of paintings and other objects that had been seen more regularly. So, you know, how really are we to read a great Chelsea tureen shaped like a rabbit? You know, what's really going on in a little Bruegel painting? Once you realize that they're trapping birds for the table, then the whole meaning of that snow scene suddenly shifts. You suddenly understand that picture differently and perhaps better, and that's actually quite exciting. But not everybody comes to works of art with the same set of ideas and questions in their head. There can be a whole range of different approaches, and if we can build those into our own inquiry, that becomes, I think, very exciting.
Did you do any evaluation of audience responses?
Yeah, so we've got some evaluations that we need to assess, but what was really also very good was that Vicky and Melissa did a lot of work with local groups, with children, for example, with old people in care homes and others, to really just sort of think through what their food issues were. And I think lots of people responded to it very positively. Other traditions of the examination of works of art, thinking about the history of science, have happened, thinking back to the Great Darwin exhibition, or more recently a fantastic exhibition about the way in which archaeologists were used to crack codes during the Second World War. These are the kinds of questions that we can ask in a university museum using the expertise that sits outside traditionally most museums, but which is here in abundance in Cambridge.
Presumably because of the COVID crisis, the museums have to think very differently about how to connect with communities and bring people in.
I think that's absolutely right. You know, there are always these code words in the museum world, like relevance and accessibility, and I'm resistant to them. I want to be telling compelling stories that help people understand that looking at works of art and artifacts from the past can help them understand themselves now and the whole world in which we live.
What about your collections of Chinese ceramics and Japanese prints and Netsuke figures? How are you going to integrate those into your display program and your exhibitions?
So I think one challenge is very much these days about how do we consider the Western tradition within a global context, and expands the story and makes our thinking less Eurocentric. We've just been given by the Addis family an incredible collection of Islamic pottery. And when you understand that some of the glazing and luster techniques that we got used to in Europe after the 15th and 16th century had been well rehearsed in Western Asia for centuries before that, then it shifts our narrative again. And when you realize that some of those techniques responded to incredible precedent in the Far East, in Eastern Asia and China above all, then again the whole narrative shifts. Ultimately, I'd like to think that what we'd be doing is showing our great strengths of European ceramics within this much broader context. I think the other thing for our future is, despite the number of objects that we have, we're a small museum. So do we want to be a mini British Museum or mini Louvre with separate galleries dedicated to our incredible Korean ceramics or the Islamic pottery? I suspect not. I think probably what we'll be looking at is a way of maximizing the strength of these collections by showing them together. We can do something maybe different that could be quite exciting, that crosses cultures and maybe even in certain moments crosses time in ways that can be quite daring.
Yeah, I think that is really exciting. I'm sad that I can't go and see the Metropolitan Museum's Crossroads display at the moment, because I'm fascinated by what they've done there, taking objects from similar periods but from totally different parts of the world, putting them side by side and giving you information about both.
Yeah, I know. I think you don't always need to come up with answers, but to be able to show that things were happening simultaneously, or that something was emerging in West Africa and southern and Mediterranean Europe at roughly the same moment would be quite exciting to explore.
And you've got a current display which I wanted to ask you about.
We were really pleased to reopen when we did in August with a 2-sculpture display. So in the gallery known as the Octagon, we've displayed the Ghetto St. Sebastian, kindly lent to us by Kolnagi, and Reza Aramesh's Action 125. Aramesh is an Iranian-born, London-based artist who worked with sculptors in North Italy to produce a series of works, of which this is one. And this shows an Iraqi prisoner isolated. You don't see his captors, but you know that they are the American invaders of Iraq, and he's been stripped to the waist and flung on the ground. And that's shown next to a St. Sebastian, similarly wearing just a loincloth. And of course, we would have recognized shot full of arrows. So 2 pieces of just under life-size polychrome sculpture of really startling presence and arguably veracity. So it feels like a good moment. St. Sebastian, of course, is a plague saint, but it's also a moment when the issues of how sculpture speak are very powerfully being reconsidered in the wake of the Floyd murder and the removal of statuary from public spaces. It's also a moment when images of subjugation feel very, very powerful, of capture, of humiliation. And then it opens up other issues too, of a degree of erotic charge that these 2 images might have. Aramesh is gay, and St. Sebastian, of course, is a figure who's come to stand for gay desire and gay suffering. In this world which has changed as a result of the Floyd murder, as a result of COVID, this juxtaposition feels urgent and interesting, and yes, relevant and accessible, those words that I'm nervous of, but I think are important for what we're talking about. What I like about showing works that are made across time, but which have obviously some formal relationship with one another, is that there's no one clear right answer. Our exhibition is as much about people's reactions to these together and separately as it is about the works themselves. This is about real participation and an acknowledgement that people respond differently and even complicatedly within their own response, that desire and disgust might not necessarily be very far away from one another. That's the excitement. It's about making sure we're promoting a conversation by putting together things in the right way. If you then invite university academics, contemporary artists, and others into that conversation, it's likely to be richer.
Do you invite the visitors to comment on it in some way? That's one of the things the internet has done, has made people very keen and feel entitled to participate, to have a say. How do you do that in person? I mean, you can do it online, but how do you do it when people come into a gallery?
It's a great question, and what we've done for this piece is simply ask questions on the label. Labels, I think, are traditionally used for making statements and conveying facts, but actually if you say, what do you think, then you're going to get people, especially if they're in groups, to ask themselves and each other, what do I think? There are opportunities online, and we're beginning to think about that too. So quite soon we'll be launching a beta website. It's a rehearsal for what our permanent website will be. And on that website, I'm very, very keen that forms of interaction, of proper involvement, of understanding that everybody brings their own experience and expertise to the viewing of works of art. Everyone has a viewpoint. And one of the challenges is to help people articulate those views in ways that make them understand that they're coming from their own set of prejudices, things that are not necessarily innate but have been taught to them over the years, and that's true for all of us.
That takes me to the other question I wanted to ask you, which is that the Sebastian was produced as a religious piece, and I think one of the big challenges for museums of Western art history is that so much of the collections is related to Christianity. It's interesting that you've taken this piece really out of its context and you don't talk about it so much as a religious icon, but about identity and about gay identity or about desire.
Well, as I say, what we're doing is giving people options. So, we also clearly label it as a saint to whom people would pray for protection against the plague. But I guess it also begs questions about when religious works of art become so human that they inspire inappropriate human response as well as a spiritual one. I think that that's one of the fascinations of how we approach the Christian religion that I suppose is in some ways the most familiar in this country, but which is increasingly foreign to many people who don't go to church regularly, and even if they do, don't necessarily know the whole panoply of saints and so on and so forth. The notion of sacrifice, for example, when somebody gives up their life for something in which they believe, is relevant to everybody. Just as thinking about how powerful words can be when they're inscribed on objects, such a fundamental ingredient of Islam, is also relevant for everybody. I think what I'm most interested in is getting people to think about what they're seeing, and by doing so, increase their visual literacy. How we take in images and how they've been formed and how they join together in our imaginations and our sense of what we know. Being more aware of those things as we encounter newspaper images, television, film, just the rest of our daily lived experience, what we absorb through our eyes, I think could be immensely valuable. That feels to me like an area which, as a broad mission, again, a university museum can do, working with colleagues from all sorts of disciplines within the university, and that's what I'd be excited about really pushing forward with.
I think you're defining a new kind of museum there, Luke, so good luck with it. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you, Nicola. It's been a real pleasure.